Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Welcome back to the InterDrone Podcast, your 30,000-foot view of the commercial drone industry. My name is CJ Smith. It is Wednesday, October 7th, joined today with Leslie Wolf. She is the conference producer at InterDrone. And our special guest today, Jennifer Richter. She's a partner at the law firm Akin Gump. Really excited to have her on. She's an InterDrone speaker, and really excited to get a little bit of a legal perspective on some of the happenings in the drone industry. So, Jennifer, thanks again for being here. If you could give our audience maybe a brief overview about some of the work that you do, and specifically how your firm works within drones and the UAS industry.
Oh, sure. Happy to do that, and great to be with you. And, we always enjoy being at InterDrone, and really sorry that we couldn't be with everybody in person this year. Certainly miss all of our friends in the industry. Mm-hmm. So our firm, Akin Gump, does a number of things with respect to advanced aviation. My particular area of focus is with respect to communication solutions for unmanned aircraft systems. So the command and control links, remote ID and tracking, all the spectrum that'll make UTM work, collision avoidance, all the connections that you need to be able to get that sensor technology back down to the ground. So CNS sort of generally, that's what I work on. And then I've got two other colleagues, Cliff Sweet and Justin Tolles, who work with me on all the advanced authorities that you need to be able to operate, waivers of 107, Part 135 authorizations, and they're working on that with some of the biggest players in the industry. And they're also, they put together some great drone programs around COVID. So anyway, really exciting couple of guys that I work with in our advanced aviation practice.
Great. And if anyone's tuning in for the first time, the format of this podcast, we talk about a couple articles from the past week, and then we do an interview with our podcast guest. So Jennifer, before we even started recording, and this wasn't one of the articles we had planned on talking about, but you mentioned there were some interesting developments yesterday with regards to remote ID. Can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Yeah, so really excited to hear. I think it was just yesterday we were notified that a draft of the final rule for remote ID has been sent over to OMB for review, which sets a 90-day clock for their review and potentially sets us up to be able to get that rule done before year end, which had been the FAA's goal. It's interesting because we've been hearing a lot over the last few weeks about concern about the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi technologies and whether they could sufficiently accomplish the broadcast function of remote ID, and that the security agencies were DOJ, DHS, really indicating to the Department of Transportation that these are not sufficient technologies. As everybody listening to the podcast probably knows, two ways to accomplish remote ID. One is broadcast, and so the FAA's proposed rule talked about using Bluetooth and Wi-Fi technologies for that, and then a networked solution, which would generally use the cellular bands and the cellular networks and the internet to provide all of the remote ID information to smartphones used by law enforcement. And the broadcast function is supposed to work where you don't have that cell coverage. So that's sort of how it all breaks down. Anyway, we'd heard that there was really concern about the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi piece, and that was going to hold up progress. I'd heard that from the FAA just 2 weeks ago. So actually, it's really interesting that it looks like they're going to push forward nevertheless and try to get this rule out. And we're very curious to see how all these issues ultimately will shake out in the report. The other rulemaking that went over to OMB is flight over people. And so there'd been a rulemaking about, what can we do to enable safe flight over people? And of course, many groups weighed in on that. And there are so many different features to safety, from the vehicle to the system that supports the vehicle. And, we'd weighed in about the importance of using secured licensed spectrum to be able to support those safe operations, through the CTIA working group that I work with. So hoping we'll see a flavor for that as well when that piece comes out. Right. One other item, sorry to filibuster you here. Other item relates to the Section 374 report to Congress. So in the 2018 FAA reauthorization, Congress asked the FAA and the FCC and NTIA to explain to them the spectrum that's suitable for command and control communications for UAS. And, do they have to rely on aviation protected spectrum? So the 5030 to 5091, that C-band spectrum, or could they use other spectrum? Like the cell networks. And if you couldn't rely, if there were barriers to using that aviation spectrum, what other options are viable, and what are the technical or regulatory barriers to those options? So anyway, sort of a free-form report on spectrum to support UAS. The FCC sent over their report to Congress maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago now. When I spoke with the FAA a couple of weeks ago, they said their version of the report is done. We were really pleased to see the content of that report. And I think that they were sending it over to DOT for finalizing and then getting it up to Congress. And we do expect that they will not only talk about how you can use the C-band and what some of the limitations are for the C-band, the aviation spectrum, but also what are the other options, and can you use networked cellular, and will that be safe enough? And I think there's good support for that as well. For any of the listeners who looked at what was the revised report from the FAA, they made tremendous progress in exploring all of the issues from their first version, which was out a year ago, more than a year ago, to this last version that came out earlier this year. So a lot of progress is being made on these issues, notwithstanding COVID.
Yeah, no kidding. And I was going to ask, how do you think COVID has impacted kind of regulation by the FAA? We've seen, I think, some waivers that maybe wouldn't have occurred outside of times of COVID. That being said, I also know that, governments, bodies are kind of feeling tight, and just like any other businesses. And, sometimes they can use COVID as a kind of a scapegoat or an excuse to maybe delay some sort of rulemaking, which they might have otherwise gotten done.
That's interesting. We really haven't seen that so much from the regulators that are important to our industry. So FCC, FAA, NTIA, and then all of the security agencies that have been involved. We've really seen them lean in and continue to try to get these important rules implemented. I think there's an understanding how important this technology is in normal times and in emergency times, and that we really do need to continue to advance the ball. So actually, I feel like they've been working harder than ever, and that's certainly great. My discussions with them, that's what I'm hearing.
That's great.
Yeah, we're seeing that track too with, I think, certain just drone verticals that did not see any sort of lapse in work during this COVID time period, which has been interesting.
I agree. And then, there's so the IPP program, the integration pilot program, is coming to an end here, but there's going to be, we think, kind of a phase 2 where participants are invited to participate in another phase of the testing. I think those projects will continue to show us how drones can be integrated in the local airspace, the valuable uses for it at the local level, how it can integrate with manned aviation, and it will continue to advance that ball. And then, to that point, North Carolina's had so many very successful testing projects that they've been doing as part of the IPP. And, and those participants are really making articles that you sent over for this week.
Yeah, I was about to say that's a perfect segue. So the first article that I did want to touch on, Skydio gaining FAA approval to conduct bridge in North Carolina. So earlier this week, the FAA granted the North Carolina Department of Transportation statewide approval to fly Skydio drones beyond visual line of sight to inspect bridges. Skydio describes the waiver as the first of its kind, saying that the North Carolina Department of Transportation will be able to conduct maintenance activities without the use of visual observers like trained pilots or staff. So like we were just touching on, we're seeing a lot of these waivers. I think what's interesting about this is actually under the current Part 107 rules. Jennifer, any insight into these waivers? What goes into them? What is that approval process? And for companies that are maybe interested in more about that.
Yeah, I love this question. Gosh, for those of us who've been working in this space for the last 6, 7, 8 years, first we had the Section 333 waivers, then we had the Part 107 rule, and now we're really exploring the outer limits of what Part 107 allows and what those waivers can further allow, and what you can do without getting a Section 135 authorization to, essentially become an airline. And these are, there's sort of a chasm between the 107 and the 135, but I think what you're going to see is these kinds of waivers, like what happened in North Carolina, are really pushing the envelope of what you can do under 107 with waivers. And let's just be clear, I don't think the process is a super speedy process yet, although I think the flight over people rule likely to come out may give us a little more insight into what the FAA expects in order to allow for safe flight over people. And that will really help to continue to allow the FAA to grant these advanced authorities. But when you have a North Carolina type of situation where they've been involved in the IPP, they've been doing the testing, they've been sending their reports, the FAA knows what they've been doing, they've sort of done the crawl and the walk, right? So now they get to run. And so I think it's a great example of the testing and advances that can be made for using UAS technology, and the trust that the FAA can give to these kinds of programs. Skydio device is, I think, well respected. The operations, the safety of the operations proved in North Carolina, I'm sure, were a huge part of the FAA granting this authority. And it provides a nice roadmap, I think, to other states that might want to go down this path.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say between this and I know Chula Vista recently got approved for, I believe it was like a close proximity, low altitude waiver. I believe those two kind of together are really starting to pave the way for more waivers being approved and kind of other states following.
Yeah, I agree. And the 135 authorizations, which I think many feel is the holy grail, and certainly a number of the big players, Google, UPS, Amazon, there are others that are going to start to come in now. I mean, that is super time and resource intensive as an exercise. And so far, those 135s that have been granted, I mean, some of them have so many exceptions, 100 or more, that it makes you wonder just how much flexibility they're really getting. And so it's so important to really study what's allowed under those 135 authorizations and what isn't, because it's really not one size fits all. Each one is very different.
Right.
So one of the things that I did when the 135 started to come out, and God bless Cliff Sweet, who works with us, I asked Cliff to not only really study these, but to start to create a database that we have at Akin now to study how the 135 authorizations and the different exceptions compare, and the standards and conditions. And so it's interactive, so we can go in and we can, put in a particular request, what did they say about, pilot certifications, and we can see what they said across the different waivers. Take someone who really knows these kinds of authorities inside and out to understand just exactly what the FAA has granted. So anyway, so Cliff's been busy, which is great.
Right.
people are calling on him to help then get their own 135s done.
Because there are 4 different types of Part 135 waivers, right? I mean, because there's like a full Part 135, which, and I forget what exactly goes into it, but then there's the reduced Part 135 sometimes means there's just one pilot at your company that's actually able to fly under those rules. So I think, to your point, they do come in all shapes and sizes. Understanding what you can and cannot do under your specific Part 135 waiver is important.
Absolutely. Now this sounds like another podcast. You should give Cliff a call. Or he'd be happy to come in and
we got to get him scheduled. Yeah. So let's talk about this second article, and this is talking about anti-drone tech, counter UAS, this article really breaks down just how complicated it is, and it's talking about you have the market and the private sector, and then the military. And this article, the first line is that the market and the military have yet to settle on the best way to stop a drone. Jennifer, I know you work a lot with the FCC. I think you were even on a panel last year at InterDrone, which was a little bit on counter UAS. Can you talk to us a little bit about that segment of our industry and some of the challenges that maybe people don't kind of they don't think about when they first think about counter UAS?
Oh my gosh, counter UAS is just like a whole realm unto itself, isn't it? So, so let's begin with who needs to be protected. Mm-hmm. What needs to be protected? I mean, I think we all know that we want, generally, the public buildings, whatever, to be protected, but there are certain kinds of facilities that might need more protection than others. And so there was a provision in an FAA reauthorization about how essential it is to protect critical infrastructure. And the FAA was to put together a procedure for designating certain types of critical infrastructure for protection from drones. That application process hasn't been finalized. And there have been a number of companies that have really tried, and industries that have tried to get the FAA to push that ahead. And the FAA has been working on it. This is one I actually check in on because it's been languishing for a pretty long time. But, you kind of have to start with who and what needs to be protected. So, the energy industry was very bullish on this. Certainly, public gathering places, stadiums, amusement parks, really important that they're protected. And
do airports into that as well?
Do the airports fit in? Yes, of course.
Yeah. Protected areas.
Yeah. And so, so we have to figure out who needs to be protected. Very important. And then we have to figure out who has the authority to protect those facilities. So, there's under Title 18, very few federal government agencies that can engage in using counter UAS technology. The type that actually, captures a drone, takes a drone down, very few. So DOJ, DOD, the Department of Energy now, and DHS. That's it. So with, local law enforcement doesn't have the authority, private industry doesn't have the authority, and, operators of nuclear facilities don't have the authority, operators of amusement parks don't have the authority, right? So there's who needs to be protected, who can engage in the protection, and then what kind of technology can they ultimately use? So we have all 3 of those buckets coming in. And then don't forget that the ability to remotely identify the drone fits into this as well, as does the UTM system. So these are all building blocks building toward the same thing, right? We have to be able to identify the drones, take down the drones, but all of the factors that I just listed come into it. So, so very complex. Certainly you can, as private industry, you can detect all day long, if you'd like, drones that are coming toward you. That
you just can't act.
Yeah. I asked this question of Earl Lawrence back in the day in one of these big public fora, and he said, well, you could have your own drone kind of act as an attack dog drone to face off the drone that's coming into your area.
Chase it away. Yeah.
I suppose you could do that. But, jamming technology, the Brookings article talks about that. Jamming technology can't be used except for by government agencies, can't even be sold to entities other than government agencies. But there are, many companies out there that are developing this technology and wanting to test it and trying to enter into CRADAs with the government to be able to test it and then to sell it, certainly to government, but not to private industry. Yeah. So, I think that's this counter UAS has so many layers of issues. Yeah. And I guess I would just back up then and say that the technologies where there's surveillance, there's the detection, but then there's the surveillance piece, which might involve actually trying to gain information from the drone, and that might impact or implicate the wiretapping laws, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act laws. There's a whole list of them that I have that we talk with clients about. And so even some of those types of technologies may not be entirely legal to use. As all of this progresses, as we have more drones out there, as people and organizations feel that there are actual threats to safety and security, the need for counter UAS technology will continue to be more and more important. Mm-hmm. But we do need to have these building blocks in place. Who needs to be protected, who has the authority to do it, what kind of technologies can we lawfully use. And then one of the things that I like to talk about is we really need a program, and I don't know who is to administer it, maybe it's DHS, but a program that will authorize law enforcement, operators of critical infrastructure to utilize these technologies. And so maybe that program certifies certain types of entities about how you use counter UAS technology and when it's appropriate to use it, and then what kinds of technologies can be used. This is kind of pie in the sky. I realize requires a legislative fix in order to happen, but I think it's really important. That's the kind of delegated authority that we're going to need in order to be able to actually use counter UAS technology and protect the public and critical infrastructure. All though.
It's pretty cut and dry. So, well, I think one thing is you said was really interesting. So, local law enforcement essentially does not have the right to take down a drone, even if they identify it acting kind of poorly or acting, outside the bounds of the laws. Local law enforcement, what do they do? What do police officers do if there's somebody and they can identify this person as using a drone maliciously? Do they have to place a call to somebody and try to get a federal agency on the phone, or what does that look like?
Yeah, well, this is really the problem, and I don't know the answer to your question. In a time situation, how do they react appropriately, and how do they know what's a cooperative drone and doing what it's supposed to do, and what isn't a cooperative drone? One that really needs to be taken out. So you've got really two pieces there. Do I have the authority, and how do I get the authority if I don't have it? Because they don't have it today. And then, but how do I really know what the problem is? And that's really where the remote ID comes in, and it's so important. And it's so important that remote ID system operates with licensed, secured networks that can't be spoofed or jammed, so that when the law enforcement person in the field sees that drone, it can identify that drone. And if it can't identify that drone, it knows that it's not a network problem. It's not that Wi-Fi or Bluetooth aren't working right now. It's that I actually, my technology is working and I can't identify that drone. That tells me that's a non-cooperative drone that probably does need to be taken out. But that's why the spectrum issues are so critical to remote ID and so many of these other systems, because if you don't have a secured licensed system, you don't really have any reliability in that system, and then you can't rely on it for safe and secure passage of drones.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces. I remember we've talked about this on this podcast before, but just the number of stakeholders in this industry is sometimes, like it always just catches, I think we almost, I don't know, we don't kind of appreciate how many parties are involved, from federal bodies to obviously the private sector, and then local law enforcement. When you're looking at the FAA, the FCC, you're talking about the Department of Homeland Security. You're talking about different broadbands used for signaling. It's just the amount of stakeholders and people that you need to get on board is pretty impressive. And you can see how sometimes things get stalled a little bit. Progress, doesn't move as fast as maybe some people in the industry want it to. We're also safety is also paramount too. So, doing something sustainable and safely with so many parties that need to participate together is immensely challenging. So you can see how we get here.
Yeah, agree. And the other thing that I thought was interesting from the Brookings article, it talked about, drones of different sizes. And, for larger drones, we have systems for detecting them, and we don't have that same thing for smaller drones, but it didn't really get into the ADSB issues. And maybe it's because that was just like too in the weeds for somebody at Brookings, but, there are problems with ADSB. It works well, great for the larger airplanes, and it's obviously working today, but you can't use that system for smaller drones. The air traffic control system couldn't take that many interrogations from small drones. It would totally crash the system. And then aerial manned aviation, which you just can't have. So we can't use that ADSB system. Also, the ADSB system it's an open protocol. It's not a secured, encrypted protocol. So that's also just an issue with that system all by itself. But what's nice about it is that it's one common system nationwide. Everybody, manned aviation world, everybody can use it. Everybody knows how to use it. And so what we need for the small drones for remote ID and for, the beaconing part, which is what the ADSB system does, is a simple unified technology that can be used everywhere, which is why networked cellular has been, something that everybody has sort of gone to and talked about and wondered, can we use this? Because there are many features of that system already today that you could incorporate on all drones, and then it could just communicate with the network that already exists, and then that helps to hasten deployment of this technology across the country. But we have to see what that remote ID rule says.
Yeah.
There has been some talk about related to ADSB, sort of a UDSB system that they might be able to put together using a channel of spectrum in the 960 to 1164. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, but this is spectrum that's used for DME today. It's not highly utilized in a way that they couldn't move around some of the uses and open up a single unified channel nationwide that could be used for this function. So this is new thinking. It wasn't part of the remote ID rulemaking, so I'm not really sure. I don't think we're going to see a reflection of that in this particular phase of remote ID, but that might be something that they start to look at moving forward. And I know there's been some testing of that done, and the FAA has been pretty encouraged. So maybe there'll be an ADSB type system for smaller drones in the future.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So kind of on the final article that we had sent over, really more just an announcement that over the past week is that Women in Drones announced the winners of their Women to Watch in the drone industry. Traditionally, this has sort of been presented at InterDrone, and the winners, I believe, fall across 4 different categories. So just a quick plug here too that at InterDrone this year, the 4 honorees will be giving brief interviews during the Women in Drones luncheon that we host. So exciting stuff there. We also work with Women in Drones on the Career Connect that we are rolling out this year at InterDrone, which is a good opportunity for attendees in the UAS industry who are looking to sort of network in a professional sense with folks from our sponsors and vendors who are looking to hire. So yeah, just wanted to touch on that one as well. But we can hop into the question section now.
That's great. And plug for Women in Drones. It really is a great organization. I've enjoyed attending those events at InterDrone and have found them really inspirational. And it is a great networking event for women in the industry, not just women and men. So yeah, so hats off to Women in Drones.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been exciting to see the growth too. The first InterDrone was in 2015, and I believe we had Women in Drones there, and it's grown now as a networking event from like around 50 people to at this point several hundred. So it's great to see everyone kind of come together. So yeah, hopping into the questions now, I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about kind of your specific career path and how you got involved sort of in the world of drones.
Sure. So I've been fascinated with technology since the beginning of my career, really since my undergrad degree. And when I went to law school, I knew that I wanted to work in the field of communications law, and started working almost right out of law school with this weird wireless industry that didn't even really exist then. This was 91, and the first wireless licenses had just been lotteried by the FCC in '88. So these networks didn't even really exist then. And so I kind of say that I grew up in the wireless industry because I started working with the companies right away that were developing the networks. And then I became general counsel of one of those companies and have worked in this field since, through 1G, 2G, now to 5G, and all the Gs after that. So that sort of set me up in an interesting spot to start to look at now what technologies and devices rely on the wireless network in order to operate. So now you're getting into the whole Internet of Things. And this is where drones really come in. So gosh, at the very beginning of all of this small drone talk, Jeff Bezos was on 60 Minutes talking about drone delivery, and we had a team of people at my prior firm that was working with Amazon on other issues. And so a group of us went over on a snowy day to Amazon to talk with them about how we wanted to do their drone work. We were doing aviation work and communications work, and working in the intersection of that. United Airlines was a client that we were working with on all of their aviation communication systems. So, but we had a broad team of people doing lots of different things. So we went over and spoke with them and landed the work, which was really cool. Right. And one of the things that I spoke with them about during that very first meeting was, okay, now how are these drones going to communicate? How do the drones communicate with each other? How do they commute with their remote pilot? How do they communicate with air traffic management systems? And their very brilliant answer, Paul Meisner, who at that point was their VP of Global Public Policy and an engineer and somebody with a communications background, said to me, well, they're going to use the cell networks, of course. And I was like, okay. He said, well, if you think about, where drones operate, and you think about how tall high rises are, and you think about being on the 100th floor of a high rise, you can use your cell phone from there, right? So if you can use it up there, certainly drones can use it from ground to 400 feet. Mm-hmm. Kind of a flying Kindle kind of notion. And I thought, okay, well, that's really interesting. Here's the problem. We don't own the network. And the FCC didn't really anticipate use of the cellular networks in this way. The licenses are for terrestrial service. Okay, can they be used for airborne or not? And that started me on this whole odyssey. So I don't even know how long ago, but probably 7 years ago now, of trying to figure out, from a regulatory point of view, could you use the cell networks to support drones? Will the licenses allow for it? Did the FCC anticipate it? What do we have to work through in terms of any interference or regulatory authorities? And while we have made a tremendous amount of progress in that time, and we've really gotten buy-in from everyone that this makes a lot of sense, FAA, FCC, NTIA, industry. I mean, it really, when we started talking about this 7 years ago, people thought we were crazy. They don't think we're crazy anymore. And everybody has embraced that this is the future, and this will be a really excellent tool for the industry. But we're still very much caught up on, do the rules, the FCC's rules, allow for these bands to be used for airborne? They don't prevent it, but do they authorize it? And is there anything that we need to do around the edges to make sure that there won't be interference? The FCC has not been activist on this, to their credit. They really are acknowledging that there are not prohibitions on using the networks in this way. They just want to make sure that it's going to be interference free, because that's their mandate. Mm-hmm. And the FAA's mandate, they want to just make sure that it's going to be safe. And when you think about mm-hmm. these shared networks, whose rights are more equal than everybody else's rights when push comes to shove. And certainly the FAA talks a lot about the need to have some sort of preemptory authority on these kinds of bands. That might not be super possible in a 4G environment, but for 5G, you can use network slicing. You could create a whole aviation slice of the network that's really dedicated to that. And then you could engage in whatever kind of, priority that you might need. So this is sort of a long answer to your question, but this is how I got involved.
Yeah, and it's a great segue to what I wanted to ask next is, 5G at a high level, what is it other than faster cell service, and how is it going to, you mentioned you were able to kind of slice the network and maybe allocate a specific band of the network to drones and unmanned systems, but how do you see it kind of impacting the industry, and when do you think we can start to see it start impacting the industry?
Yeah, this is a great question with multiple factors that I can bring in. So, so 5G, what is it? It's a more dense network with lots and lots of cells. If you think of all of the networks as being, various versions of a cell. When we started, back in the early 90s, the cells were massive, right? You would put a transmitter up on the top of a mountain and you would hope to be able to reach as many people as possible, which was for sort of downstream traffic, but not so great for upstream, right? Mm-hmm. As we've moved up the Gs, the cells are getting smaller and denser, and there's more spectrum in every cell. And the whole, network, the whole 5G network is all about increasing capacity and speed by making those cells smaller, connecting it to fiber optics. It's a much more high performance system that allows for the kind of machine to machine communications that you need for drones. And principally, that's because with these much smaller cells and everything much closer together, the latency is substantially improved from where we are on, 3G or 4G. And you need those instantaneous communications in order for this to be a safe option. So that's why everybody looks to 5G and says, we think this really makes a lot of sense. But it's not just 5G. So let's talk about communities. Let's talk about smart cities. Mm-hmm. A city, in order to enable all of these next generation technologies to operate, they really need to be thinking about, is my city smart? Do I have adequate fiber optics? Have I allowed for the deployment of dense wireless in my city, which might include, tower siting and attachments and that kind of thing? Have I allowed for sensors to be placed throughout my city? Do I have advanced storage capacities and edge computing? And have I overlaid all of that with cybersecurity and AI, right? So if a city has done all of that, now that's a city where you can actually go and operate drones very successfully, and not just on the ground, but even think about advanced air mobility and passenger drones higher in the sky. You know, the testing has proved that the cell networks can provide really good reception to 3, 4, 5,000 feet without modification of the network. So that's really important. But we need these smart cities to exist, and some are further along than others, but that needs to be sort of a nationwide effort. And so then I'm going to move to NASA. And what's NASA doing about all of this? Well, you know, really to their credit, they're working on a whole communications infrastructure for drones and for advanced air mobility. 5G features prominently in that. But it's not, you know, 5G is not the only technology, right? We have the unlicensed bands, which will still have a use, and we've got to figure out what are the right and safe uses for that. We've got the cell bands that can be used 5G, so that's great. And then we have the aviation protected spectrum, and all of this needs to interoperate and communicate and be part of one cohesive system. And then you need to think about what bands are going to be used for what purposes. So am I going to use the aviation bands for my safety purposes, so my takeoff and landing, but am I going to use my cell bands for traveling in between, particularly when I'm not over people? And how can I dynamically switch among these? And that requires technology not only in the system, but on the drone. So there's a lot going into that. And companies like Airbus, Uber, Boeing, Lockheed, really, you know, working hard on these kinds of questions, which takes you know, tremendous amount of effort. But NASA, to its credit, also is really working through this architecture and has indicated some interest in getting some testing going. Very preliminary. We're trying to work that through and trying to get all the right parties to the table on that.
Right.
Exciting. A little bit about your work with the FCC, and I think for background too, a lot of people in the UAS industry and our audience are sort of aware of how the rules and regulations of the FAA affect governing. But if you could maybe speak a little bit about the rules and regulations of the FCC and sort of how that affects the UAS industry.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So as I indicated earlier, the mandates are really different between the FAA and FCC, but they do have to, on issues like this and really, you know, all aviation communications issues, they really do need to work together, and they do. So mandate of the FAA is about safety, and mandate of the FCC is really about, you know, technology coexistence. Prevention, you know, let's make the most we can of all of the spectrum resources we have and other kinds of telecommunications resources. And let's do that in a way that is interference free, that allows, you know, all the different uses to coexist peacefully. So the communication systems really are foundational. We can't have an operating UAS system or an operating UAM or AAM system without communication systems that enable command and control, remote ID and tracking, collision avoidance, UTM. There are so many different uses for the spectrum, but it's really the FCC that has the authority over that spectrum, and they set the rules, the technical rules, and the service rules that relate to all of those bands. Typically, the FCC has just engaged in this for manned aviation, and all of those spectrum bands are regulated under Part 87 of the FCC's rules, which are all appropriate for manned aviation. We don't really have a rule part for unmanned, you know, spectrum for unmanned systems. And one of the questions we've been raising with the FCC is whether that's necessary. And one of the reasons that might be necessary is that you wouldn't necessarily want to regulate systems, communication systems for unmanned aircraft with reference to rules for manned aircraft. And why is that? Because there might be some unintended consequences there, like there has to be a pilot in command when we talk about Part 87 but we don't have a pilot in command. We have a remote pilot in command, but that's not literally what the rule says. There are spectrum bands that can be used for aviation, like the general aviation bands, where it says, you know, the system has to be able to communicate with a pilot in the cockpit. It actually says that, right? We don't have a pilot in the cockpit, right? And so, like so many things, our technology has advanced beyond where the regulations are today. And so we have to help the regulators to realize that these same rules could be used, but we need some tweaks around the edges in order to make sure that we can use these bands for all of these new technologies that are coming up. So when we have battles at the FCC about how different bands can be used for unmanned aircraft, these are the kinds of issues, I hope it's not too boring, but these are the kinds of issues that we really talk about, because it's important, because we want to make sure we don't shoot ourselves in the foot the first time out of the gate. So the 5030 to 5091 spectrum is really interesting. So this is the C-band spectrum that the ITU recommended for allocation around the world for drones, for command and control for drones. This was a long time ago. This band was 2012, I think. And there was another band from 2007, the 960 to 1164. And the FCC has finished the allocation rulemakings for those. So the FCC agreed with ITU and said, you know what, that makes sense for us. And we're going to allocate the bands for those purposes. So use for drones. But we don't have service and technical rules yet. So AIA filed a petition for rulemaking a couple of years ago now, and asking the asking the FCC to create service and technical rules for the 5030 to 5091, and wanted to base those rules on the work that the RTCA has been doing to create CNPC standards. That has stalled, that petition has stalled, and the FCC hasn't yet started a rulemaking. And part of the reason is all of these issues I was just talking about. Like, we need to make sure that the FCC isn't saying this is the only band that can be used for UAS, because of course we could use all of these other commercial bands. We want to make sure that when they create UAS rules for the first time, that maybe it's not in Part 87, which deals with manned aviation, and maybe in a different rule part, or that we, you know, do a very rigorous review of Part 87 to make sure that we create all the right exceptions so that it doesn't apply to UAS. You know, we're really asking the FCC to approach these rulemakings in a very conscious and deliberate and careful manner, so that we can future-proof these regulations for, you know, the next 20, 50, 100 years. That's a tall order, but that's, you know, that's sort of the goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think this conversation has been eye-opening to me about how much impact the FCC has on kind of a nationally adopted system, right? You know, I think the FAA, you know, we talk about the FAA all the time, and I think, you know, a drone pilot or a drone or a private company, right? The FAA is kind of the gatekeeper for them, but when we're talking about actually implementing a nationwide system, you realize how much impact the FCC has, and how you know, how much responsibility that they have to kind of make sure we're doing it the right way and creating something that is sustainable and will last.
That's right. And Chairman Pai, the currently sitting FCC chairman, has been interested in drones. The FCC has had a technological advisory council that's been looking at the drone issues, and I've been sitting on that for the last few years. We didn't have one this year, but just sort of asking some of these questions and getting the Wireless Bureau at the FCC and the Office of Engineering and Technology really involved in examining these issues. You know, it's an election year, so we'll see what happens with the presidential election. We'll see what happens with Chairman Pai. Does he stay or go, depending on whether Trump wins or not. If Trump doesn't win, there'll definitely be somebody else in the chairman's position. And then it's important for industry to really, you know, raise these issues, make sure the FCC understands how important these issues are to aviation, and to help perform that, you know, that function that coordination function with the FAA. They have regular meetings, and there are interagency governmental councils that get together and talk about these issues. But industry plays a really important role in helping both the FAA and the FCC understand what's needed. So looking forward to see what happens next with the FCC and how we can get these drone issues on their radar.
Right. Last question before we let you go. What do you think, if anything, is holding the industry back, and what would you like to see?
Well, I think honestly, the single biggest roadblock for everything has been the absence of remote ID rules and standards and a deployable system nationwide. Because once we have remote ID, a system that's sort of authorized and built out and ready to go, a lot can happen with drones, right? We need our remote ID system. We need our UTM system. They're making great progress. So I think we have a really good start between, Lance and the work that NASA did on UTM, all the great work of PK there. These are the essential building blocks. I like to think about it as, remote ID, UTM, counter UAS. Okay. These are really the three pieces. And with those pieces, we have an industry. Really looking forward to seeing what this remote ID item says. Hopefully it's pretty close to what they released last, February. I think February.
I think it was the start of the year, yeah.
The NPRM, yeah.
Yeah, so hopefully it's pretty close to that. I mean, I recognize that there might be some concerns about some of that broadcast technology, but hopefully they can find a way to just move ahead with what's good or good enough so that we can start to make progress there. Those systems certainly, and then continuing to figure out these communication solutions issues, which are so foundational.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thanks again for joining us, Jennifer. Really enjoyed the conversation. If anybody wants to get in touch, learn a little bit more, maybe ask some questions, how can we point them in the right direction?
Sure, you bet. So we're at Akin Gump. That's just akingump.com, AKIN as in Nancy, GUMP. And I'm J Richter at akingump.com, or you can contact me on my mobile phone, but I won't give you that number here. I'll give that number to our nice friends at InterDrone, and they can pass it.
There we go. There we go. We'll put the we'll put the contact website and stuff links in the description. Right. And if anybody's listening to this on Spotify or SoundCloud, make sure to subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe, ring the bell. This will be posted on Apple Music, Spotify, SoundCloud, wherever pods are casted. So thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next week.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.